Good evening. It is question and answer night. You ready? Here we go. I was telling Scott Harp about the questions that I've been getting, and many of them I can tell are from the younger, just the way they're written, and and some of them put their names on it, and then some of them tell me after they put it in anonymously, then they tell me, hey, I put that in. That they just, and Scott was very encouraged over that, how the young ones are very involved in the question and answers. So that's great. It is one of the reasons why I am trying to keep up with all these questions, and I know I'm behind, but every service we get more and more questions, so that's great. I appreciate it. Okay, here's the first one. Was the devil an angel? That's a good question. Was the devil an angel? Maybe you've heard that before. Maybe you've heard that Satan is a fallen angel. And well, the young ones are thinking about this, and I can tell it's a young person, and they're thinking, well, I don't want to just take someone's word for it. I want to know for sure, does the Bible teach that? And that's awesome. Just for different things like that, you want to, even as adults, we need to think critically, at least in the right way, and see, what does the Bible say? Does it say that? Does it teach it? Can we gather verses together that leaves us with that conclusion? And so, here it is. The Bible never directly states that he was a fallen angel. There's just not a verse. If you happen to know a verse that kind of says that, you can let me know afterwards, and I'll gladly correct my mistake. But there is nothing in my studies where it says that Satan is a fallen angel or originally was an angel. Now, let me give you some verses to think about on why there is this thinking or this conclusion that he is an angel in the past, or some kind of angel that's fallen. Well, in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, in verse 14, Paul is talking to the church that is in Corinth. 2 Corinthians, and there he is talking about really the problems that they're having. Now, 2 Corinthians deals more with, thank you for getting back on track on many things. But there's still some things to work on. Well, one of the things he says is, who's behind all this? Well, it's Satan. 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 14. Well, let's start with verse 13 for some context. For such are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into apostles of Christ. There's false teachers among them, and they're telling them some things that are false. And we recognize that in other places in the Corinthian letters, where they're getting false doctrine about the resurrection and baptism and mixing different things that they shouldn't. And they're letting these false teachers say these things. And he's saying, there's false teachers among you, and they're pretending to be apostles of Christ. That is important, because they are not apostles of Christ. Look at verse 14. And no wonder, exclamation point, for Satan himself transforms himself into an angel of light. The false teachers are pretending to be apostles. They are not. No wonder, Satan does the same thing. He pretends to be an angel, but he's not. That's the point he's making. Now, that doesn't mean that he was never an angel, but it doesn't prove that he was either. It just shows that he can change himself into an angel of light, or at least make it seem like he is an angel of light. We see the same thing today. There's false teachers that, they'll give falsehood and you think it's true, but then there's some really extreme examples of this where people really do like the devil. And they really think that he can bring something good for society, And there are people who are making statues and really wanting society to accept Satan worship and things like that. And you have this statue that people try to make, and it has Satan with a child, and kind of their way of showing that Satan can really teach children some good things. That's an extreme example, but the point is, there's nothing new under the sun. Satan wants to transform himself into a role that people think is good. Okay, so there's Satan. What about the angels? Let's talk about that for a second, because we're going to see the similarities. The angels at one point rebelled in the past. And no doubt, we look at Jude 6, the verse that was just read. The angels who did not keep their proper domain. Maybe yours says something along the lines of their proper authority, or proper dominion, or something of that nature. Well, the angels, they didn't do what they were supposed to. They didn't stick to their role. They didn't stick to where they should be. They misused their power, and because of that, they left their abode, Jude says. And there it says, God has reserved an everlasting chains of darkness for the judgment of the great day. Right now, the angels that did fall, they are somewhere being reserved for the last day, and then they're going to go somewhere worse. Well, let's turn to 2 Peter chapter 2. 2 Peter chapter 2 in verse 4. Peter's talking to the Christians who are scattered, going through persecution. 2 Peter chapter 2 in verse 4. And this is very similar to what Jude brings out. But notice in verse 4, for if God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment. Now, there in verse 4, that word hell is not the same word as you see in other places. It's really not the same hell that, always is talked about when we think about the word hell. Maybe yours has a footnote that says Tartarus. That's a different word. It's a different spiritual place. Not much is said about it other than that's where the angels are. They rebelled. When did that happen? It doesn't say, but it happened in the past. Somewhere in the past, the angels decided they are not going to do what they're supposed to. It says they sinned. In other words, they had a law to follow. They were supposed to follow the law code that was given to them, and they rebelled. Because of that, Jude and Peter works together to give us the whole picture. Jude says they left their abode. Well, it was because of their actions that they were kicked out, really. That's what Peter brings out. They were cast down to another place. So God sent them down, but at the same time, it was their fault. It was their fault, and because of their sin led them to that place. So really, they sent themselves. It's pretty much the same whenever Judgment Day happens, and then Jesus comes and then casts people into outer darkness, into hell. Well, yes, Jesus is the one that sends them there, but who ultimately sent them there? It was themselves. Same thing with the angels. God threw them down, but it was because of what they did, and so they did it to themselves. Okay, keep that in mind with the angels. Go back to Satan. There was a time when Satan sinned against the law that was given to him. How do I know that? Jesus calls him the father of lies, and he was a murderer from the beginning. John chapter 8 and verse 44. So that means he is the first one to lie. He is the father of it. He's the originator of it. Truth comes from God. Satan came around and he lied. He said, you shall not surely die. Lie. What did that lead to? It led to their sin. And when man and woman sinned, it brought about death. And in that way, Satan has always been a murderer from the beginning. Turn with me to 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 6. 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 6. Paul is talking to young Timothy, and this is what he says concerning the qualifications for an elder. 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 6. So a bishop, verse 1, is the same thing as an elder, a pastor, bishop, presbyter, different words. It's all talking about the same one, the same office. When it comes to the qualifications, look at verse 7. Moreover, he must have a good testimony among those who are outside, lest he fall into reproach and the snare of the devil. That's not the verse. Verse 6, sorry. Verse 6. He is not to be a novice. In other words, a newly planted person. A new person. He's not don't let him be a novice, lest, here's the reason why, here's the wisdom behind this, lest being puffed up with pride, he fall into the same condemnation as the devil. In other words, when you're looking for elders, do not choose one who was just baptized last week. You know, we're not going to choose someone who's super young because they're not ready. You give them power and it's going to get to their head and they're going to misuse it. Well, that he says he's going to be just like Satan. The power that he had, and he became prideful and he rebelled. We can't have that. So it tells us something about the wisdom behind choosing elders, but for our study, we notice something about the devil. He, through his pride, sinned. How did he sin? Well, he lied. And he also was brought in death through that. Now, is there any other ways that he sinned? It doesn't say. Some say that he tried to be God and in heaven and there was a war, but really we don't have anything that tells us that. A revelation is more of looking at the future and what, there's victory with God and talking all in symbolic language. But as far as was there ever a war in heaven in the past, we don't have that. We just have that Satan, he became prideful, he lied, and he brought in death. And because of that, he had to be thrown down. There is also a passage in Luke chapter 10 and verse 18. In Luke chapter 10, there Jesus sends the 70 men, and he sends them out to preach. And he gives them the ability to heal the sick. They go around and he tells them what to do. When you go around, do this and that, you heal the sick, and if they don't listen to you, this is what you need to say. So he sends these 70 out. Then the 70, they come back, and their faith was so strong that they not only healed the sick and preached the gospel or the coming kingdom, they also were able to cast out demons. And they were surprised. They came back and they basically told Jesus, we were able to cast out demons in your name. And what does Jesus say? I saw Satan cast down like lightning, fall down like lightning. And then he starts talking about what they're able to do. Was he talking about something in the past? Was it something that happened right then and no one saw it, only Jesus? Some say it's a prophecy that's going to happen, that it goes from one spiritual part of the world to another. And God, it doesn't really say, but with the context there, his point is Satan has lost more influence. I saw Satan cast down, figurative way of saying, look at what you're able to do through your faith. But it is interesting still that he uses that imagery. Could be something that did happen or was to happen. So think about this. The angels rebelled. Satan rebelled. Was it at the same time? We don't have all that that's given to us in the Bible. It's not recorded. But we know that they do work together. We know this because in Matthew chapter 25 and verse 41, when Jesus is talking, he's talking about that last day. He says, then he will say to those on the left hand, depart from me, you cursed, into the everlasting fire prepared for the devil and his angels. So they're connected. There's Satan and his angels. They are his messengers. That's what angel means. They work for Satan. And both Satan and the messengers, his workmen, they both together are going to go to this place called hell. And anybody who did not do what they're supposed to as humans, their souls will go to that place that was prepared for the devil and his angels. And this is why, put all this together, that people will say, well, if he has angels and he rebelled and he's in that spiritual place, then he has to be an angel in the past. Possibly. I'm not saying it's not a possibility. It is. But there's nothing that's real concrete to say, yes, for sure, he was an angel, he's a fallen angel. But what we do know is his end. And that's the most important thing to consider. Satan had to, with other verses, how God creates things and good things come from his creation, and Satan not being divine, he had to be a created being, and so there had to be a time that he was sinless. But when angels sin, that's it. They're cast out. They don't have chances like us. The book of Hebrews talks about that. That God, through his plan, it was all for mankind, not angels. We are looked at in more interest to God than the angels. Now, you think about what Hebrews also brings out. In Hebrews chapter 2, Jesus is greater than the angels, and then the angels are greater than us as far as their power. And yet, Jude and Peter says, they were cast down. If God did that to the angels, then what makes us think that we can just do whatever we want? That's Jude and Peter's point. We don't know if Satan was an angel or not. What is revealed is enough for us to be prepared to fight against him. He's a liar, and he keeps on doing that. He hasn't stopped. He sends false teachers. They pretend to be apostles. They pretend to be God's spokesmen, and they speak lies. And Satan is tempting people to do this. Satan is tempting people to lie to themselves. Oh, I can do this, and all I have to do is just ask for forgiveness. Oh, I can do it again, and all I have to do is ask for forgiveness. They're lying to themselves. They're misusing the grace of God. Romans chapter 6 talks about that. We can't lie to ourselves, and Satan wants that. Well, some people say, well, I don't follow Satan, but I still do what I want. Well, that's a lie. Because if you're following just what you want, then you follow Satan. You see, you're falling for a lie. No matter what sin, no matter what false teaching, there's always some kind of lie involved, whether to yourself, to others, trying to cover it up. The sin itself may be a lie. It all goes back to the father of lies. Well, we also know that Satan is not stronger than God. Let's say he was an angel. Let's say he wasn't. No matter what, God is still stronger. God is stronger than the angels, and God is stronger than any other being. God is stronger than anything that has been created. Satan hates us. He'll tempt us. But so what? God helps us through it. He helps us endure the battles that come our way. And so we know that one day that Satan will have an end. And that should suffice for us. Okay, here's the next one. Behemoth and Leviathan. Is Behemoth and Leviathan a metaphor, or were they real monsters? I like this one. There's a lot of crazy pictures whenever you go on the internet. Or Apologetics Press has some good renditions of that. Behemoth and Leviathan. Well, first, the question says, were they real monsters? The word monsters could be subject to various definitions. It depends how you're using that. Well, in the Greeks, they had their set of monsters like Medusa. Medusa wasn't really a god; it was considered a monster. Is Leviathan and behemoth like that? The answer is no. They were not mythical characters. They were not mythical creatures. But if we're talking about real, physical, terrifying animals that people had seen in the past, then yes, both Behemoth and Leviathan were that. And let me prove it to you. Now, before we do, I want to say this. In Isaiah chapters 27 in verse 1, I'll just read it for you because it's just really quick. Isaiah 27 verse 1, on that day the Lord with his cruel and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan the fleeing serpent, Leviathan the twisting serpent, and he will kill the dragon that is in the sea. Context there, and looking at everything in and out, historical context, and just how he's talking, he is talking about three nations. And he's using Leviathan as a figure of speech. Now, it does make it possible that these are real animals, but it's not enough. But you kind of start there and you see they're using some kind of creature to show us something about Egypt and Babylon and Assyria, those three, and how it all fits with the rivers that mark their boundaries, and how there's a fleeing, twisting. And so there's more to talk about that. But those are three kingdoms. But it's not until we go to Job chapter 40, Job chapter 40, that will help us out tremendously. Job chapter 40. Much that has happened in this entire book following or preceding chapter 40. But just real quick, Job went through a lot. He suffered a lot. And him and his friends, they're battling this in their minds, and they're having big discussions. The friends are saying, you sinned, and Job said, I didn't. And Job didn't. And we know that from the conversation he had with Satan, or God had with Satan. But here, Job, he has to be taught a lesson, because there were times that Job did have some things wrong. You see, he knew he didn't sin, but then he still struggled. It was still a struggle for him, and he was still thinking, well, I shouldn't have been born. Why did I have to be born? Why is this happening to me? He's still trying to figure it out. And he's saying, well, God, why don't you take it away? Well, he's asking all these questions to God, and then God comes to him. Actually, it doesn't start in chapter 40. It starts in chapter 38, but he comes to Job in a whirlwind, and he's basically teaching Job, here's the answer. I'm God. That's what he had to learn. God didn't say, well, I had a discussion with Satan, and he was going to test you, and so this is why I'm doing it. I'm allowing it to happen. He didn't say any of that. He came to Job, he said, Job, I'm God. Look at all these creatures, and he starts listing all these creatures. Who created that? Where were you when this happened, when creation? I'm God. And that's all he needed to know. So he just needed to trust God. That was the main thing. Okay, so context there. Chapter 40. Moreover, the Lord answered Job and said, shall the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? He who rebukes God, let him answer it. Then Job answered the Lord and said, behold, I am vile. What shall I answer you? I laid my hand over my mouth. Once I have spoken, but I will not answer. Yes, twice, but I will proceed no further. He's getting the message, but God's not done yet. Then the Lord answered Job out of a whirlwind, a tornado, and said, now prepare yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Because Job had asked him questions. God, why this? Why that? Now God comes to him, well, let me ask you some questions. Would you indeed annul my judgment? Would you condemn me that you may be justified? And he starts talking about different things. Drop down to verse 15. Look now at the behemoth, which I made along with you. He eats grass like an ox. See now, his strength is in his hips, and his power is in his stomach muscles. He moves his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are tightly knit. His bones are the beams of bronze. His ribs like bars of iron. He is the first of the ways of God. Only he who made him can bring near his sword. Surely the mountains yield flood for him, and all the beasts of the field play there. He lies under the lotus trees in a covert of reeds and marsh. The lotus trees cover him with their shade. The willows by the brook surround him. Indeed, the river may rage, yet he is not disturbed. He is confident through the Jordan gushes into his mouth. Though he takes it in his eyes, or one pierces his nose with a snare. So, if Job cannot overpower the behemoth, how can he challenge God, who is more powerful than this creature? He's questioning the creator of this huge beast. And God says, look at this. Look at the behemoth. Who created the behemoth? But notice how he says, look in verse 15, look now at the behemoth. What if Job said, what are you talking about? That mythical creature that people made up? That's not even a real thing. No, he would have seen an actual animal. God is showing him to prove a point. Look at the behemoth, which I made along with you. I made you, Job, and I made this animal. So you're talking to the maker of both of you. So it wouldn't make sense for God to say, consider the mythical animal that's not real. Who made that mythical animal? You know, it wouldn't make sense as what he's trying to convey to Job. Okay? Consider the cedar tree. Here's a picture of a cedar tree. Now there's different pictures, I try really hard to find a person near a cedar tree, but I know this doesn't give it justice. Maybe it'll give you some insight of how big they are. They grow up to 120 feet high. I want you to think about that. 120 feet high, you know how thick they are? They can grow up to 8 feet in diameter. So, no luck giving it a hug. You know, it's huge. And here he says, his tail is like a cedar. The reason people have problem with the behemoth is because the description of behemoth and the Leviathan, it favors so much a dinosaur. And those who, you know, evolutionists who try to say, well, dinosaurs never were with humans and they have trouble with this. Well, the behemoth, it can't be a dinosaur because Job would not have lived in the time of dinosaurs. Dinosaurs were millions of years before him. And that's why people have trouble with this. And then they try to say things where, well, you know, this is not a dinosaur. And some will actually say it's a hippopotamus. You ever seen the tail of a hippopotamus? Does it look like this? You ever look at a hippopotamus tail and say, wow, that's like a big old cedar? I mean, nobody does that. Other people will say this is an elephant. Have you seen the tail of an elephant? Now, don't get me wrong, the elephant's big, it's huge, but the tail is not. It's like the smallest thing on him. And so it doesn't make sense. But see, people are trying to force something because they're trying to say there's no way that Job would have seen a dinosaur. But he's saying, look at it, Job, look at it. Well, some will say, well, it cannot be a dinosaur because, well, it has a navel. That's how one of the verses say in verse, was it 16? See, his strength is in his hips and his powers in the stomach muscles. Of course, mine says stomach muscles. Here, I found what commentator says, Wayne Jackson, brother in Christ. The word rendered navel in the King James Version of the Bible derives from the Hebrew term sharur. Scholars have suggested that the term originally meant firm, hard, hence denoting the firm parts of the belly. And so yours might say navel, some might say stomach muscles, sinew, or something like that. Some will say, well, this is a mythical animal. But I want you to think, look at verse chapter 38. Okay, this is in the same context, right? So Job is saying a little here and there, but mostly God is talking, and he's basically making the same point throughout the whole thing. Look at chapter 38, and there, let's see, verse 39. Can you hunt the prey for the lion, or satisfy the appetite of the young lions when they crouch in their dens or lurk in their lairs to lie in wait? Who provides food for the raven when its young ones cry to God and wonder about the lack of food? So ravens, lions, okay? Drop down to chapter 39, verse 9. Will the wild ox be willing to serve you? Will he bed by your manger? Can you bind the wild ox in the furrow with the ropes? You know what I'm about to say, right? Look at verse 13. The wings of the ostrich wave proudly, but are her wings and pinions like the tiny stork is? So now we got ostrich, we got stork, and there's other animals that he brings up, the eagle in verse 27. Okay, so he gives these different animals that when we see them, we have no problem. Lion, yeah, we know what he's talking about. Ostrich, yeah. Raven, yeah. Stork, yeah. Behemoth, oh, that's myth. That's a mythical creature. But that's not consistent. That doesn't go with the context. He's telling Job, look at all these animals that exist. People don't have a problem until they get to the behemoth. But why would he use real animals and then all of a sudden he used a mythical creature? That wouldn't really prove what God is trying to tell him. He's teaching him. Okay, so chapter 41. Actually, the whole chapter talks about it. But just give you a little bit. Can you draw out Leviathan with a hook, or snare his tongue with a line which you lower? Can you put a reed through his nose, or pierce his jaw with a hook? These are rhetorical questions. In other words, no, you can't. You can't do that. This is a super beast. It's huge. It's strong. You're not going to be able to do that. That's his point. Can you go over there and pierce his jaw with a hook? His point is, you can't. Look at verse 18. His sneezes flash forth light, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the morning. Out of his mouth go burning lights, sparks of fire shoot out. Smoke comes out of his nostrils, and from a boiling pot and burning rushes. It is descriptions like that people say, oh, this cannot be a real creature. Look at that. I mean, light coming out. That's like fire. That's something we see in movies. Why is it hard to believe that this is a dinosaur? It has to be a dinosaur. Of course, this goes into a whole discussion about evolution and how that's wrong. Another lesson for another day. But this is one place where he's saying again, look at this animal. Can you do that? You know, if this is a mythical animal, then Job would have turned around and said, I don't know, I've never seen a Leviathan. I thought that was a fake animal. No, he would have said, oh yeah, I know that Leviathan. There's no way I can do that. Yes, you're right, God. I cannot go over there. He's stronger than me. And God's proving, look at this great beast. I'm the one that made it. So while Job is going through all these troubles, how is he to endure all these troubles? Just know that God is God. He's the creator of the biggest beasts. And so we just got to put our trust in him. Some will say that the Leviathan is a crocodile. Consider Steve Irwin. He was able to wrestle crocodiles, and he did it with his bare hands. Actually, the ancient Egyptians did the same thing. He wasn't the first one. That would not make sense of what God is trying to tell Job. Job would have said, well, yeah, we have people around who wrestle these things, but I don't understand what you're bringing up. But he's saying, you cannot go do that, because this is greater than a crocodile. Okay? God is talking about a real creature, real animal. And though it seems too fantastic for us, there are animals that go instinct all the time. There are some that are endangered. So is it possible that this animal doesn't live anymore? Yeah. Now, it doesn't mean that man necessarily did it. Maybe nature itself just took its course, and with the weather changes and environmental changes, it just died. Or maybe, more plausible answer, is that this was written before the flood, and then what happened is some of the dinosaurs died. And some will say, well, how can you put dinosaurs on the ark? Of course, you can go all through this trail, right? My quick answer is, you can put any dinosaur on the ark if it's just a baby. So, is it a real animal? Yes. Both of them are real animals. Do they exist anymore? Not that we have seen, but that doesn't mean they never existed. It just means they're extinct. And the point for us is, when we're going through tough times, God is not going to tell us, Josh, you are going through this because, well, you know, I'm letting Satan tempt you, or tempt you so that I can test you. I had a conversation with him, or I needed this to happen because this would bring about a good result. He's not going to say that. But what he is going to say in his word is that any trouble that we go through, we have something greater for us waiting, and that's heaven. We're not going to be suffering anymore. And we have to trust in God that he is greater than any of the troubles that we go through. He is greater than any animal. He's greater than any person. He's greater than Satan. And because of that, we put our trust in him. Well, great questions. Thank you so much for these questions. I have more coming. But maybe there's something in this lesson that has maybe sparked something in you that you need to get right with God, the God who has created the greatest of all beasts, all this nature around us, even ourselves. You need to get right with him and ask for forgiveness. Maybe you've been out of service. Maybe you just need to do what's right now, and you can overcome Satan's tactics. Because one day, him and his angels, they're going to be cast down into this fiery place forever. And I don't want to be where they're going. I don't want to know what it looks like. I don't even want to have a single glance on that direction. I want to be far away from that place. Do you? Do you need to obey the gospel? Do you need to make it right with God before it's too late? If so, let us know as we stand and sing.